Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of Iceland and the School of Social Sciences, I'd like to welcome you warmly to this open seminar. The title of the seminar is The UK Independence Party, the Conservatives, and Attitudes Towards European Integration in the UK. This seminar is a part of the series Europe Dialogues, hosted by the Institute of International Affairs at the University of Iceland. This is the final seminar of the series. The Institute has hosted 10 seminars this academic year to promote an informative debate on European integration in Iceland. Today we are welcoming two distinguished guests from the United Kingdom. Dr. Philip Lynch is Senior Lecturer in Politics, and Dr. Richard Whitaker is Lecturer in Politics at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Leicester. In a joint research project, they have been examining party competition between the Conservatives and the UK Independence Party, with the primary focus on the issue of European integration. Today they will be examining these two political parties and discussing the growth of Euroscepticism in British politics. They will analyze British public opinion on European integration and ask an easy question: if there is a referendum on EU membership, who will win? I am really looking forward to see if they get anything else that my standard answer may be. Finally, the topic will be discussed in relation to Icelandic politics. The format of the seminar is such that they will speak jointly for around 40 minutes. Then we will have a debate, discussion, opportunity for short comments and questions, and we will end the seminar at 1:15 today. And let us just start, and it is Philip that will be the first one.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and particularly say how interesting it is to come here and hear the debate in Iceland about EU membership, which has some interesting parallels with discussions in Britain at the moment. Euroscepticism is growing across Europe, from Greece to the United Kingdom, from Iceland to Spain. We see this growth of Euroscepticism. As the cartoon here suggests, it's perhaps no longer impossible to think of a time in the near future when the United Kingdom isn't a member of the European Union anymore. Here we see British Prime Minister David Cameron, the leader of the Conservative Party, taking Britain further away from continental Europe. Where is the destination? Is Britain heading off towards Iceland into the European Economic Area or elsewhere? So what we're going to do today is look at the reasons for the growth of Euroscepticism in Britain and speculate as to what would happen if there is a referendum on British membership of the European Union. And we're going to focus on the two key Eurosceptic parties in the United Kingdom. The Conservative Party is Britain's, probably Europe's, oldest and most successful political party. It was in government alone or in coalition for some 75 years in the 20th century. Defeated heavily in 1997, now back in power, but in a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats. And the Conservative Party is also perhaps the most significant mainstream Eurosceptic party in the European Union. And as some of you may be aware, it's allied with Iceland's Independence Party in a transnational group called the Alliance of European Conservatives and Reformists. The UK Independence Party is a much newer party, formed as a purely Eurosceptic party in 1993 with a goal of taking Britain out of the European community as it then was. Has no MPs at Westminster, but its support is increasing and has increased significantly since 2010. And the UK Independence Party is a populist Eurosceptic party, and there are some similarities with other parties elsewhere, like the True Finns in Finland, for example. These are the two main Eurosceptic parties. We do find some Eurosceptic MPs in other parties, but they're certainly in a small minority. So when we have a look at party position based on expert surveys here, what we see in the bottom right-hand quadrant there is the Conservatives and UKIP are the parties closest together on both left and right, on the economy going across and on attitudes to European integration. They're both on the right of the economic political spectrum and both relatively Eurosceptic. You'll notice that the Liberal Democrats, who the Conservatives are in coalition with, are relatively close to the Conservatives on the left-right scale, but are not close on the scale of European integration. So Conservative Euroscepticism has been watered down a bit because they are in coalition with a more pro-European party. We also see, of course, in Britain, it's not just Euroscepticism among political parties. British public opinion has often been more Eurosceptic than many other member states. Recent surveys show Euroscepticism growing in Greece and elsewhere. But this gives an example from 2011 of the difference between UK attitudes and those of the EU, then 27, on average. And what we see is that we find in Britain, more people than average tend to think EU membership is a bad thing. More people tend to think that Britain hasn't benefited from being in the EU, and particularly very strong opposition to the single currency. And we'll come back to that later in the talk. I think it's useful at this stage to follow a typology developed by two British academics on Euroscepticism, Paul Taggart and Alex Serbiak, distinguish between hard Euroscepticism and soft Euroscepticism. Hard Euroscepticism is essentially principled opposition to European integration. So this could be, for example, a party that doesn't want to join the European Union or wants to withdraw from the European Union. And the key example in Britain is the UK Independence Party. Its platform is very clear: withdraw from the European Union. Currently led by Nigel Farage, often seen drinking beer, and putting forward this populist image of a man of the people against the political elite. He's also the co-leader of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy group in the European Parliament, which is a loose collection of Eurosceptic parties. But we also find this hard Euroscepticism in the Conservative Party. About 1/3 of Conservative MPs could fall into this category of people who would like either to leave the European Union or want such a fundamental change that Britain would be in little more than a free trade relationship with other European states. And it's interesting, having heard today's debate this morning, there was very little support amongst British Eurosceptics from going from the European Union into the European Economic Area. The argument being that Britain would still have to implement European regulations and directives, but would have less say on the decision-making process. But the official Conservative Party position is soft Euroscepticism. Soft Euroscepticism being not principled opposition, but opposition to elements of what the European Union currently does or plans to do. So, for example, what we see in the Conservative Party's official leadership position is they want to stay out of the Eurozone. Britain didn't sign the fiscal compact on further tax harmonisation and so forth. Next year, the British government has to take a decision on whether it stays in or opts out of large areas of European police and criminal justice cooperation. It looks like Britain will opt out of many of those. The Conservative Party wants some repatriation of EU powers. What that means is taking powers back that are currently the competence of the EU and returning them to national parliaments. So that would include things like employment policy. And the Conservative Party also implemented something called a referendum lock, which says that any future treaty that Britain signs that transfers powers from Westminster to the European Union would have to be put to a referendum of the British people. But crucially here, in this soft Euroscepticism, David Cameron, the Conservative Party leader, wants those changes to get a looser European Union, but has made it clear that he wants Britain to stay in the European Union, and in an in-out referendum campaign, he would campaign for Britain to stay in. Europe has long been a difficult issue for the Conservative Party, just as it's becoming a difficult issue for many mainstream centre-right parties. I'm going to very briefly go through 3 reasons why Europe's been a difficult issue. The Conservatives have changed their position, it divides the party, and you've got this challenge from a more Eurosceptic party, UKIP. Here we see a picture of Mrs Thatcher in the only other time Britain has held a referendum on the European Union, which is in 1975. Britain was already a member of the European Economic Community, as then was. There was a referendum on whether Britain should stay in, and there was a 2-to-1 vote to stay in. And Mrs Thatcher campaigned for the yes campaign. Britain should remain a member of the European Economic Community. Because at that time, the Conservative Party was the more pro-European party of the main British parties. But pro-European in a very British sense, free trade, Europe of nation states, opposing a federal Europe. 1988 was a key moment. Mrs Thatcher made a famous speech at the College of Europe in Bruges, in which she set out her opposition to European integration, and that has coloured Conservative politics ever since. And here, the ideological reasons, the Thatcherite combination of support for the free market and defence of national sovereignty. So the Conservatives support the single market, but want it to go further and be less regulated. They oppose the single currency, tax powers, aspects of EU social policy. And a defence of national sovereignty, that Britain should get opt-outs, Britain should retain its national veto, national parliament should get more powers. So the Conservative Party's changed position. And interestingly, Conservative voters changed their position at the same time. Conservative Party voters are Eurosceptic, and more Eurosceptic than the Conservative Party leadership position. The Conservative Party has long been divided on Europe. This shows just some of the key votes in the House of Commons relating to the EU. So the debate in 1972 in the House of Commons on should Britain join the European Economic Community saw some 10-12% of Conservative MPs voting against their party line. The Single European Act, the Conservative Party is largely united. They like the single market idea. Maastricht, the party is divided between pro-Europeans who want Britain in future to join the single currency and Eurosceptics who think this is a step too far. Lisbon Treaty, the Conservatives are in opposition, largely united in opposing the Lisbon Treaty. But the biggest single division in the Conservative Party in Parliament has come recently, a vote in 2011 on whether there should be a referendum on British membership of the EU. And there we saw 81 Conservative MPs rebel, defy the party position on that. And more recently, David Cameron has to change his position on this because of this dissent in the party. So as I've said, what we've seen is the division in the Conservative Party has changed. There are very few pro-Europeans left in the Conservative Party, perhaps 30 out of 308 MPs could be seen as pro-European, but even they don't make the case for Britain joining the single currency. The split is between those soft Eurosceptics who support the leadership line and the hard Eurosceptics who want a fundamental renegotiation or want to leave. And these rebellions in Parliament over an EU referendum have forced David Cameron to change his policy, and Cameron's saying that if the Conservatives win the next election in 2015, a Conservative government would renegotiate Britain's membership and then hold an in-out referendum. And this week we see a bill in the House of Commons saying that that EU referendum should happen by 2017. And Cameron, who 3 years ago was saying he doesn't support a referendum, is now saying, yes, I support this move. So the Conservative Party is divided over Europe. What do leaders do to deal with these divisions? Well, familiar things that have some echoes in Iceland about how parties deal with divisions either within their parliamentary party or if there's a difference between what the party supports and what its members or voters support. So we often see the Conservatives making policy compromises that are rather vague, or pushing decisions off, saying, we won't deal with this now, we'll deal with it at some future date. We'll wait and see whether we should join the single currency. We will hold a referendum, but not yet, because we want to see how the European Union develops. And they promise referendums. You take the issue away from a divided party in Parliament, and say, we'll let the people decide. And this, of course, may bring electoral benefits if, as in Britain, one party says, we'll give you the referendum you want, and the other party says, we're not sure. The problem with this is that promising a referendum may reduce dissent in the short term, but when you get into a referendum campaign, the splits become still more apparent. And the danger for the Conservative Party is, if we do get a referendum, the party will be really divided. And of course, this additional element that makes the European issue so difficult for the Conservatives is the emergence of UKIP. UKIP takes support from the Conservatives amongst Eurosceptic voters. Those voters who think Europe really matters are drifting off towards UKIP rather than voting Conservative. UKIP has reframed the European Union issue. So rather than the debate being about what are the economic benefits of Britain, UKIP is focusing on immigration from Central and Eastern Europe. UKIP is saying, you can't trust the main parties. Labour said it would give you a referendum on the European Union, and it didn't. The Conservatives have long said they'll give you a referendum on the European Union, but haven't done yet. You can't trust them. So UKIP makes it difficult for the Conservatives because they're focusing on issues that are problematic. But what the main parties, both Labour and Conservative, has done is they've lowered the salience of the EU issue. What I mean by that is the debate on Britain and Europe is a debate between political elites. It matters a lot to the Conservatives. It matters a lot to UKIP, but it doesn't matter to your average British voter. As we see here, back in the 1990s, some 40% of people said the EU is the most important issue facing Britain. Today, 5% of people think this is the most important issue. And what UKIP have done is said, OK, so you might not be concerned about the European Union itself, but you should be concerned about what this means for immigration and so forth. Finally, on UKIP's challenge to the Conservatives before I hand over, UKIP is the first challenge that the Conservative Party has faced on the right of the political spectrum. The Conservatives have long had that space to themselves. There have been two centre-left parties, and the Conservatives the only party on the right. And UKIP is deliberately targeting the Conservatives. It's populist. It's an anti-establishment message at a time when people are disillusioned with the main parties. It focuses on immigration. It focuses on social conservatism, so it opposes gay marriage, for example. And this creates a strategic dilemma for the Conservatives. The Conservative Party is only going to win elections in Britain from the centre ground of politics. But they're not going to win the 2015 general election if they lose too many Conservative voters to UKIP. Drifting to the right would be dangerous for the Conservatives because they'd lose the support of people in the centre, the median voter. But if they don't do anything about UKIP, they could well fail to win the next election. UKIP doesn't have to win a single seat in the next general election to damage the Conservatives. The chances are UKIP won't win a seat in the general election because of the electoral system. But if it takes enough votes off the Conservatives, they will not win. OK, what I'll do now, I'll hand over to Rick, who'll tell you more about the growth of UKIP and who supports it, and then on to that question where you've predicted our answer, what would happen if Britain held a referendum? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, I'll talk a bit about UKIP itself and the nature of its support, and then I'm going to move on to talking about the possibility of a referendum in Britain on EU membership and what we think about that. This is just to put UKIP's position in perspective, this graph. So the black bars here show you its performance in European Parliament elections. The clear ones show you its performance in general elections in Britain. In all of those that it's competed in. And you can see here that UKIP does much better in European elections than it does in general elections. This is partly down to the electoral system, but it's also down to the fact that the salience of the European issue is, of course, much higher in those European elections than it is in general ones. So UKIP finished second in the 2009 European elections, beating the governing Labour Party into third place there. The last general election saw UKIP increase in proportional terms its support by 50%, but nevertheless it's a small party when it comes to general elections at the moment. But as Phil was saying before, UKIP don't have to win seats to cause problems for the Conservatives. And in fact, it seems unlikely that they'll win any seats in 2015. Perhaps they might win one, but it seems fairly unlikely. But in the shorter term, there is much speculation in the UK about whether UKIP might win the 2014 European elections in Britain, and there seems a reasonable chance that that could be the case, particularly with Conservative voters unhappy with the diluted position of the Conservatives in the coalition at the moment. So if we look at more recent polling data, we can see how well UKIP is doing. This is based on YouGov polls, asking people how they might vote in a general election. And you can see there's a fair lead for the opposition, main opposition Labour Party at the moment, the red line at the top, and the Conservatives who are in government are the blue line there. So the UKIP and the Liberal Democrats have been vying really for third position, and these data are from the last 18 months in the UK. But there's been a considerable rise since the local elections in May of 2013 in Britain for UKIP support. And this, as a proportion of the support it was getting at the start of this period, this is really quite a considerable rise in UKIP support. Now, how far this might translate into seats, as I say, it's unlikely to, given that the support is spread quite thinly. But where is this support coming from? Well, part of the answer to this question we can find by asking people who voted for the three main parties in 2010 who they might vote for if there were a general election tomorrow. And you can see these are the proportions that say they would vote UKIP from each of the three main parties. And you can see the blue line at the top shows that the Conservatives are losing out to UKIP more than any other party by some considerable distance. Interestingly, given their position on Europe, Liberal Democrat voters, some of those have shifted towards UKIP. And although it's difficult to prove this at the moment, it seems reasonable that part of that is that some of these voters wanted to support a party that they didn't see as part of the mainstream, that wasn't a governing party. Liberal Democrats are, of course, now in government, and so they are part of the mainstream very much. So some of that protest vote may have shifted, although I don't think we can demonstrate that empirically very well at the moment. But we can also see a bit more about UKIP voters by looking at their characteristics. So these show you the percentage of UKIP voters that have particular characteristics, and this compares them with other voters for other parties. And you can see here that UKIP voters are, this is based on the last 12 months from May 2012. UKIP voters are generally a little bit older than voters for other parties. They're more likely to be male as well. They're also slightly more likely to be white British in terms of their ethnicity. But the class profile, if we measure it by the profession of UKIP voters, is not very distinct, actually, from voters as a whole. So they don't stand out dramatically in terms of the class profile. So they tend to do slightly better amongst skilled and semi-skilled workers, slightly worse compared with other parties amongst those who would classify themselves as professionals or managers. But the big difference here is in the level of education, and this is consistent with what we know about support for populist parties elsewhere, that those with an education beyond the age of 18, those with a university education, are much less likely to support UKIP than they are to support other parties. It's also worth saying that UKIP tends to do better in coastal areas of the UK if we look at its geographical range of support. So some areas in the northeast, but also on the south coast of England where there are fishing communities. And this is something that I'm sure will make sense to everyone in this room. So, how can UKIP achieve their goal of getting the UK out of the European Union? Well, in doing this, they face a strategic dilemma. So they're doing better in opinion polls at the moment, but they still face a tricky problem about how to achieve UK exit from the EU. At present, the best chance of this is via a referendum in which voters are asked whether they would like to remain in the EU or whether they'd like to leave. Now, at the moment, there's no chance of UKIP, or even in the medium term, there's no chance of UKIP forming a government in the UK. And so the problem that UKIP face is that the best chance of this happening is under a Conservative, majority Conservative government, who, as Phil said before, are promising a referendum on this. So the problem here is that UKIP face a clash. Their policy aim is to get Britain out of the EU, but they also have the aim of increasing their vote share. And it's possible that these two may run in different directions. To the extent that UKIP winning votes decreases the likelihood of a Conservative victory, then the vote-winning strategy may undermine the policy-seeking strategy that they have. So they face a tricky question about what to do in contests, and of course we have a single member plurality system for general elections in Britain. What do they do in contests where there is an incumbent, hard Eurosceptic Conservative MP? Do they fight a campaign against that person and risk splitting the vote and seeing Labour winning the seat? Or do they fight stand down in that particular constituency and choose not to fight? Now, the research that we've done on this suggests that there are mixed views in the party on how they should deal with that particular dilemma. In the past, what they've done is to not stand against incumbent MPs who have demonstrated their hard Euroscepticism. It seems, as far as we know, unlikely that any deals will be done with the Conservative Party, but this question raises tension within UKIP about whether they should do some deals and choose to stand down in certain seats. So they face a tricky problem there with regard to how to cope in the general election. Okay, having explained UKIP's position and the dilemmas that they face, I want to move on to lastly talk about a referendum on EU membership in Britain. So, as Phil's already alluded to, David Cameron has promised an in-out referendum, but there are various things that have to be in place for this to happen. This would be held after the next general election in Britain, which should be in 2015. It may possibly be earlier, but unlikely. So this requires the Conservatives to win a majority at the next general election, which there's no guarantee of this, and it doesn't look that likely at the moment. If the Conservatives don't win a majority, then it depends on the nature of a coalition agreement that they might form, if they're to form a coalition government. Alternatively, they could end up in opposition, of course. Second, if the Conservatives do win a majority, or they're in a coalition that signs up to this in-out referendum, then David Cameron has pledged to renegotiate Britain's membership of the EU to devise what he calls a new settlement between Britain and the EU. And he's interested in repatriating powers in some areas of policy, which Phil talked about, but also in ensuring that the divide between countries that are in the Eurozone and countries that are outside of it doesn't create problems for the countries that are on the outside of the Eurozone, as the Eurozone becomes more integrated with the fiscal compact, etc. And then after any renegotiation, a referendum would be held. So there are quite a few steps that have to be gone through before this could happen. Now, this pledge of a referendum has left the other parties with questions to answer about what they might do. So recently, the Liberal Democrat leader, Nick Clegg, has said that if a new EU treaty has to be agreed as a result of negotiations, then there should be an in-out referendum, which is clearly moving much closer to the Conservative position. As yet, we don't know what Labour might do on this. We don't know whether they will promise a referendum or not. They haven't made that clear at the moment, so we'll have to wait and see. But there'll certainly be enormous pressure on them to do that. So what might happen if a referendum were held? Well, this graph shows polling data from Ipsos Mori, asking people if there was a referendum on British membership of the EU, how would you vote? And the red line there shows people who would vote to leave, the green line people who would stay in, and the grey people who don't know. And I should add a warning about these data. They're taken at rather irregular time points. The gaps are quite different, so there's quite a lot of surveys towards the end of the 90s, and then not very much in the last 10 years. So bear that in mind when you look at this graph. But what this shows is that there's been quite a lot of fluctuation. But still, in recent years at least, we have a plurality, if not quite a majority of voters who say they might vote to leave the EU. But importantly, a considerable chunk of voters say they don't know. And YouGov polls on this show higher proportions, normally about a fifth of people saying they don't know how they might vote. So that could be important for who wins this campaign. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I want to just digress slightly to say something about the nature of Euroscepticism in Britain and the kinds of people that hold more Eurosceptic attitudes. So this is taken from a Eurobarometer survey and shows the differences across different groups in terms of their views of the EU. What we see here is that those with more Eurosceptic attitudes tend to be older voters, those with lower levels of education, those who are in manual occupations, and also we know who live in rural areas as well. And as Phil said, not only are there those differences, but party differences have changed over time. So Labour Party supporters have become more pro-European, Conservative Party supporters have become much less so since the end of the 1980s. But these things are not that dissimilar from what we find in other countries when we look at the nature of those with Eurosceptic attitudes. So, who might win if there were to be a referendum? Well, there's a few factors that we would need to consider to answer that question. The first is, what can David Cameron manage to negotiate if he is even in a position to do that? How much change in terms of UK membership of the EU can he get agreement for? And I'd argue that he will need to get other member states on board such that these changes are not just UK specific if he's going to be successful. Because trying to get changes specifically for the UK could well be difficult if these aren't seen as part of a broader package of change in the EU. If he can't manage to achieve much change in Britain's relations, then it may be difficult to carry voters with him, and even more difficult to carry his party with him. Second, of course, any referendum campaign, as Phil has suggested already, would draw attention to Conservative divisions on this. It seems clear that a good number of Conservative MPs would campaign for Britain to leave the EU, even if there were a renegotiation of its terms of membership. And of course, a divided party provides much less clear cues for voters when deciding how to vote in a referendum. So this graph shows you an interesting set of results about people's views if there were to be a renegotiated UK relationship with the EU. Now, the trouble is we don't know exactly what that might be. But the question here is, if David Cameron renegotiated Britain's relationship with the EU and he came back from that and recommended that we stay in the European Union, how would you vote? And this is quite a different graph from the one you saw before. So there is pretty much 50% support here for staying in the European Union under a renegotiated settlement, and a fair bit less support for leaving. But the amount of don't knows is quite high here. And of course that's a reasonable answer to give in a question like this, because which way you vote may depend on the extent of renegotiation of membership. So how does a desire to leave the EU vary by party support? Well, this graph shows you that. And as in line with what Philip was saying earlier, the Conservative Party has the largest proportions of people who would vote to leave the European Union by quite some way. The Liberal Democrats appear to be the most pro-European, if we look at this graph here, which takes data from August 2011 on those things. So this suggests that David Cameron might have to do quite a lot to convince Conservative voters to stay in the European Union in any referendum that might follow a renegotiation. There are other factors there that we would need to take into account, and some of these relate to what we already know from research on referendums on the EU in other cases. So in particular, the context and the nature of the campaign can make a difference. We know from previous research that, the views that voters have of the party and government at the time and their attitudes towards the economy may affect the way they vote in a referendum. So some research suggests that voters who are less happy with the government would be more likely to vote against the line that the government is supporting in any referendum campaign. Also, the effectiveness of the campaigns on each side will most likely affect the result. So those campaigning for the UK to remain in the EU may well focus on the unknowns that might follow if Britain left. What kind of deal would we have? How would this work? How might it affect our economy? How might it affect our balance of trade, etc.? And that the fear of that unknown might be used to persuade voters to stick with the status quo. Let's stay in this organisation because we just don't know how it will work if we leave. On the other hand, those campaigning for the UK to leave could focus on the negatives of membership. So this, something UKIP have talked about a lot, is the cost, the financial cost of membership. The decision-making that has shifted from the UK to the EU's institutions. The amount of immigration that results from EU membership. the divide between countries in the Eurozone and countries outside of the Eurozone and the problems that might flow from that. But these are all negative things, and so far UKIP hasn't developed a very good positive case for the UK to leave the EU. So they're mainly focusing on the problems that we have as EU members, and less clearly on the benefits that might flow if the UK were to leave the EU. And clearly then UKIP would need to build a more positive campaign to convince those in the don't know camp, those who are not sure about how they might vote. But both of these campaigns will need to target those with softer opinions, those who might be swayed one way or another, and those who are currently in the don't know group of voters. And whoever wins over the most of those is likely to win this referendum, because otherwise the two core groups are fairly close together, but with some kind of lead for the out. So, to wrap this up, what might happen in the future to Iceland and the UK? And we raised the question here: could Iceland join as the UK leaves the European Union? Well, it seems clear that the prospect of Iceland joining has decreased, of course, in recent times. The prospect of the UK leaving the EU seemed unthinkable, say 3 or 4 years ago. But now it is a possibility. This is not something we should discount. But we think it's perhaps not likely to be the case. Now, an alternative scenario might see Iceland joining a looser European Union, which we've alluded to already, in which the UK and other countries are in a kind of outer tier or second tier of EU membership. In which case, would Iceland, as a member of the Schengen Agreement, join the first tier or the second tier? This is a question that I'm not sure of the answer to, but worth raising. Now, this, it seems likely, will be left to referendums in both countries to decide. And this allows Eurosceptic parties to push this difficult issue of the European Union out of the parliamentary arena and into that of voters. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for very interesting lectures. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Now we will go to discussions. I might sort of start off by asking you, because you ended Richard saying that a referendum in Britain was likely. That of course would depend on the next general election, and actually on the standpoints of Labour and the Liberals. And sort of wouldn't one say that the likelihood of the Conservative winning an overall majority in the next general election must be considered quite small? Labour victory would be much more likely, isn't it? If there was a hung parliament again, wouldn't it be more likely that the Liberals would now join the Labour Party, especially if Labour would be the bigger party than the Conservatives? So the question would really sort of your comments on this scenario, and also, do you think it is likely that Labour will commit itself to a renegotiation, second, to a referendum in out? Because it seems to me that if they don't do that, and if there would be either a Labour majority government or a Lib-Lab coalition, the likelihood of a referendum taking place at all has decreased quite a bit. I might add, while you were thinking, that I found it also very interesting seeing this profile, especially on education, because we see this quite a bit on populist parties and sort of extreme right-wing parties in Europe. Recently in Iceland we have had very clear examples of this, a similar profile in 2 elections. Firstly in the presidential election in 2012, where the current president, Ólafur Ragnar, that was re-elected, had clearly had this profile. Much the support increased, the less education voters had. And now in the Alþingi elections in this spring, the Progressive Party also had this profile very clearly. But would you like to comment on the scenario that I was?
Shall I start? Yes, that's right. Rick went through the scenarios and suggested that this in-out referendum depends on a number of things, some or none of which may happen. The opinion polls at the moment tend to suggest that Labour will win the next election, but Labour's lead of about 5 to 8% in the opinion polls is rather small at this stage of a parliament. And I think the Conservative strategy is, if the economy in Britain starts to get better, which is an if, but it looks like it might gradually be doing so, then their polling position would be strengthened. So it's not impossible that the Conservatives could end up as the largest party. It looks unlikely that they'd win it outright. That takes us then to, if there's no clear winner, what coalition might we get? And you're right that the more natural combination is Labour and the Liberal Democrats. But Liberal Democratic strategy recently has been highly critical of Labour, even though the Liberal Democrats are trying to distance themselves from some of the things the Conservatives would like to do if in government themselves. So it's by no means clear that you'd get that Labour-Liberal Democrat coalition. So it's certainly perhaps more likely now than it was a year ago that the next election might deliver another Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. That then raises the tactical dilemma for Labour that you mentioned. Will it support renegotiation? I think it'd be difficult for the Labour Party to go into the next general election saying we support the status quo in terms of Britain's membership of the European Union, but it certainly wouldn't support an extensive renegotiation. Would it support an in-out referendum? Labour's instincts would be no. But to use a British phrase I don't know would translate into Icelandic, is the genie out of the bottle? Now that many people think there will be an in-out referendum, is it difficult for any party to say, actually, no, we don't want to give you a vote on this issue? Because that plays into the hands of the likes of UKIP, who are saying this is the elites deciding and not trusting the people. So Labour's in a very difficult position as to what it does. And one potential scenario, Rick and I agree that the stay-in campaign is likely to win the referendum. But one potential scenario would be that Labour wins the next election, does call an in-out referendum, and the Conservative Party has got rid of David Cameron and has chosen a more Eurosceptic leader. So instead of all the main parties campaigning to stay in, you have a Labour government that wants to stay in and a Conservative opposition that wants to get out. That might make the referendum more likely to vote out. But all this is speculation, of course. In terms of UKIP support, your comment there, yeah, it's interesting in common with other populist parties as well that UKIP is also winning some support of people who haven't voted recently because they don't trust any of the parties. Protest votes, yeah. And Euroscepticism in Britain, as I think we hinted at in the talk, is also quite strongly linked to views on immigration. Yeah.
The point on genie out of the bottle is sort of interesting in the Icelandic context because the current coalition has sort of halted the negotiations. In recent opinion polls, a majority, sort of 50% against 40, have been supporting continued negotiations, even though a majority still is opposed to membership.
Yeah.
Now we had a poll this morning, I think, showing that 80% of the voters and also around 3/4 of the government party voters in the last election, they want a referendum on if negotiations should be continued. Yeah. And obviously the government parties, they want to postpone a referendum, but the question was on should there be a referendum on continued negotiations at the local elections next year, which basically would guarantee probably an 80% turnout. Yeah. And with 3/4 of their own supporters saying yes, they might have genie out of the bottle.
Referendums are a difficult thing for governing parties because you might think you'll win and some other issue occurs or you're just not very popular and the vote is not what was predicted.
It's a very tricky.
If I could just add to that, it's also a tricky thing with opinion polls because often if you ask people do you want a referendum, they will say yes to almost anything. Do you want to stay on this? Oh no, I don't want to stay. Yeah. So this is a problem with using the results of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to also want to make comments or ask questions to state their names. And you go first.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Marius Mazzotti. Dr. Lynch, you, I guess, already partially answered my questions. However, considering the fact that, or considering the history, how UKIP was founded by Alan Sked back in the early 90s, and that he left the party because he said he can't deal with people like Nigel Farage and the anti-immigration stances that totally stand against his libertarian, yet Eurosceptic ones. So how would you explain this dynamic between Euroscepticism and then issues towards anti-immigration, anti-gay marriage? Is this really a phenomenon that is unleashed by nationalist attitudes?
Do you want me to answer that straight away? Yeah, one question.
Yeah.
UKIP has moved away from just talking about the European issue in recent years and focuses more and more on immigration, but is doing so in terms of migration within the European Union. I think it's worth saying that, like many populist parties, UKIP doesn't really have a coherent narrative. It doesn't all add up into a coherent message, but does that really matter? If you're essentially a populist party saying we're different from this lot, I'm not sure many voters even know or particularly care about what UKIP's policies are on a range of issues. They just know that they're not one of the normal parties. They don't like immigration, they don't like the European Union, and that's enough.
But if I can just add to that, there is a degree of tension within the party between its libertarian wing, because many are, especially the younger group within UKIP, are very libertarian. You know, legalisation of drugs, for instance, all this sort of stuff, and so this anti-gay marriage stance, which seems like an attack, which seems like a strategic response to the Conservatives' problems over this, doesn't fit with that libertarian stance. So there is a lack of coherence within the party on that.
Alison Bales, I have two different questions. First, one referendum that will definitely take place is next autumn on Scottish independence.
Yes.
And the signs are that a clear, although not enormous, majority of Scots are keen to stay in the EU. Have you found any evidence that Cameron's policies are bringing votes to the Scottish nationalists? That would open up some quite intriguing scenarios. My different question is that having heard lectures about right-wing populist parties in general, a categorical division has been suggested between those who work peacefully within a constitutional system and those who work, as it were, in the streets and by violence. So would you put UKIP clearly in the first category, and in that case, has it been successful in differentiating itself from the National Front in similar groups? Thank you.
Shall I start again? Okay. Yes, the referendum in Scotland, the referendum on independence for Scotland, there are interesting connections with the EU issue, because in Scotland, support for the European Union tends to be significantly higher than in the rest of the United Kingdom, although that does seem to be decreasing in recent years. But certainly, yes, one of the messages that Alex Salmond, the Scottish First Minister, the leader of the Scottish National Party, is saying is that if Scotland votes to stay in the UK, it may mean that Britain has left the European Union. The dilemma for Salmond, though, and for the Scottish nationalists is that some of the legal advice from the European Commission is that if Scotland becomes independent, Scotland would have to apply to join the EU like any other applicant. In other words, Scotland leaving the United Kingdom would automatically leave the European Union and would have to reapply. So there are interesting overlaps there. In terms of the categorisation of right-wing populist parties, UKIP is clearly in the first category, and UKIP has been very wary of being associated with the far-right parties, such as the British National Party. Some of its support clearly does come from people who have far-right positions. And one of the dilemmas for UKIP is in the European Parliament, where it's allied with some of these more extreme parties. So, for example, in the next European elections next year, it's interesting that in France, that the Front National is predicted to do very well. Would UKIP join them in a European Parliament group, or would that be toxic? Would it damage UKIP at home if it was seen to be associated with these more extreme parties?
Yeah, I just add that if you look at the basis of support for UKIP and the BNP, the British National Party, you can distinguish it. I mean, we've shown this at the last European elections, for instance. There are certain differences between them. So the BNP attracts more voters from lower incomes, lower down the social scale, as it were, than UKIP does. UKIP has a less distinct class basis of support. And for its voters, European integration is the big thing in a way that whilst the BNP is a hard Eurosceptic party, it's not so central to what it does. So you can clearly distinguish those two parties in terms of their support. But still, there's a group of voters that might move between the two.
Hello, my name is Sigurðan. Do you think that the promise of a referendum next year, next term, will appease the voters of the Conservative Party, or will they continue to surge to UKIP and thus spoil the elections for the Conservatives, keeping in mind their great success in the last local elections?
Do you want to have first go this time? Or you have your read to carry on?
No, I think they will continue to lose support to UKIP, but I think that the psychological effects of the electoral system will probably come in, which is to say that you've got to think about which party is actually likely to win government, which party is going to win seats, etc. And I think that this will reduce the extent to which there's a leakage of support. And clearly Cameron's gone quite a long way to try and appease the most Eurosceptic members of his party and voters to try and deal with that. And with this bill that they've got going through at the moment, he's doing even more to try and not lose too much support. But I think there's a certain group of people that have gone to UKIP and they won't come back. There are councillors who defect from the Conservatives to UKIP every week, aren't there? I think frequently. So they've clearly lost a group which will be difficult to get back. But I think in a general election it won't be a huge leak in support to them. But.
Yeah, essentially, if we look at opinion polls, and there are some problems with doing this, after Cameron's speech in January of this year where he promised an in-out referendum, UKIP support didn't really change. Indeed, as you say, it went up towards the local election. So Cameron's promise of a referendum didn't see UKIP support collapse. It wasn't the magic formula for defeating UKIP. In fact, if we look back to December 2011, when David Cameron vetoed an EU treaty, there are arguments whether it was a veto at all, his opinion poll ratings went up and UKIP's went down because people liked the idea that Britain could stand up for itself in the European Union. So perhaps that's the sort of message that Cameron needs to get across, that Britain can win the arguments in the European Union. In terms of the other point that Rick made, I think David Cameron has hit upon a position, renegotiation and then a referendum, that should unite the Conservative Party. Most Conservative voters and MPs broadly support that. But his problems are that many of his MPs don't trust him, which is why we see this week an attempt to put it into law that there will have to be a referendum in 2017, because many Conservative MPs think that we know David Cameron doesn't want this. We know he wants to stay in the European Union, so will he try to get out of it?
Thank you for very interesting lectures. I wonder, do you see any possibility in the British political system that there is a space for a substantial right-wing party, like a similar sense as Front National in France, where they have hold between 10 and 20 and even about 20% regularly in elections? Is there is the kind of winner-take-all system in Britain that does preclude that kind of development? Yeah. And if there is a space for that kind of party, what kind of coherent policy do you think that the Independence Party will develop? Because it's not enough to be only against the EU, especially if Britain wants to go out, and then that kind of issue is gone. So in a sense, they need to develop one broader right-wing populist agenda. And what kind of agenda do you think that they will develop in addition to immigration, which is of course almost an issue. Religion, for example, what is the kind of attitudes on these issues? Anti-Semitism, corporatism, and those kind of that seem to be different in Britain than they are on the
Yes, there is a space which is partly created by the Conservatives being in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, which has forced them to dilute some of the policies, and this is why there's exacerbated problems of division within the Conservative Party, which we're seeing evidence of in not just on the EU, but in things over the gay marriage legislation that's going through Parliament, for instance, so on other issues as well. So there is a space, but the thing in Britain is that we have different electoral systems for different levels of government, and this creates different party systems. So we have a party system for general elections which is quite different from that. Well, it's changed a lot, don't get me wrong, but nevertheless it's still quite different from that for European elections. So we're talking about UKIP winning those next time round. So UKIP remain really quite important in this European Parliament election scenario, and now a little bit more in the local election one, but less so in the general election situation in terms of taking seats and that sort of thing. So there is a space for them, but the electoral system doesn't allow them to develop that very well at the general election situation, but it does for European elections. And to a degree, because of the second order nature of them, it allows development of that at local elections. So it's hard to see them in the medium term, at least, having lots of MPs at Westminster and being a substantial kind of third party in the House of Commons, I think. But Phil, do you want to add some more to that?
Well, I broadly agree with you. Yes, that there is clearly space in the political spectrum for a radical right type party to emerge, and to some extent UKIP might be that party, although they clearly want to distinguish themselves from far right extreme parties that are anti-Semitic and anti-Islamic and so forth. In terms of religious cleavage, there isn't much of one in British politics, although UKIP's attitude to gay marriage is in part an attempt to try to focus on those sorts of issues in terms of traditional Christian values. We've had similar things in Britain in the past. We had in the 1980s a breakaway from the Labour Party, the Social Democratic Party, that for a while was doing very well in the opinion polls. In the 1983 general election, it finished 1 percentage point behind Labour, but only won about 30 seats. And within a few years, it had died away. The danger for UKIP is that happens to it as well, that it goes into the next general election, people will think it will do well, but it doesn't win any seats, and then it's a wasted vote, and it dies down again. So there are lots of institutional hurdles that UKIP would have to get over.
Hello, Peter. It was 10 seconds for a name. Just a follow-up to your point made on Scotland having to reapply if it has the UK to the European Union. How significant is that really? Is this anything that really matters? I mean, would they lose all their benefits immediately until they have had, because a renegotiation can take years and years and years.
Exactly.
Now, would they lose all their benefits immediately, or do you think they would get some sort of adjustment period, a grace period of a few years to negotiate?
I suspect so. I suspect there will be some sort of transitional period. I think the importance of that issue is more as in line with what Rick was saying before, that in a referendum campaign, you can frighten voters, saying, the alternative to the status quo is this leap into the unknown, that Scotland would no longer automatically be a member of NATO. Scotland would no longer automatically be a member of the European Union. Scotland may not be able to keep the pound as its currency. Whether or not these are legally true, and whether it be transition periods, perhaps matters less than the prospect of scaring voters into voting for the status quo. There's different legal advice, of course, on what would happen to Scotland. The Scottish National Party disputes this advice from the Commission and others that they would have to renegotiate, they would have to apply for entry.
They will of course start by applying for the Nordic Council.
Former member of the Icelandic Foreign Service. Given this growing concern in the UK that the EU, as it is, does not sufficiently put the island state of Britain, and that British influence within the Union is not sufficient, what does that indicate about the position of Iceland if it joins?
Yeah, very good. Do you want to take this, or shall I?
I think you can take that one.
Oh, thank you. There's no easy answer to that, because I think it in part would depend on what parts of the European Union Iceland signs up for. Because clearly Britain is not a member of the Euro, and one of the big concerns in Britain is that states who are members of the EU but not of the Euro aren't excluded from important decisions on the single market, for example.
That has been indicated as one of the main gains by those who advocate membership.
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, it's very interesting listening to the debate this morning. A point I mentioned before, that in Britain, that there's really no sense that if Britain were to leave the EU, it should join the European Economic Area. I think the debate team is quite different in terms of the extent to which there are alternatives such as the EA and EFTA. One potential scenario, as we hinted at the end, is if Britain is successful in arguing for a looser European Union, then that may make it easier for different states to slot into different parts of the European Union. So your debate here in Iceland may look very different in 5 years' time than it does now if the Eurozone states integrate still further, if some states such as Britain are able to bring policies back to national governments. It's quite a different sort of European Union from the one we've had now, we've had so far.
Yeah, just add that point on the European Economic Area. It's fascinating to hear the arguments about this here, because as Phil says, in Britain, people are saying no, we shouldn't be in that because we lose the influence over the single market rules.
And not in Schengen, of course.
Yes. So Eurosceptics would argue against that scenario, which is a scenario that's favoured by people in Iceland that want to stay out of the European Union. So it's fascinating to hear, because people's take on that, on the EEA, is quite different, I think, between the two.
Yes, it's just a small question. At what point do small parties start winning significant amounts of seats in the British system?
When they manage to concentrate their support in certain constituencies, so the Green Party have one MP, for instance, because they have a high degree of concentration of support in Brighton and Hove, is the seat that they've got. You have to target seats. You have to go for seats where you've got a good chance of winning, put lots of resources into them, and concentrate support in those areas, and maybe win by a very small margin, get a plurality of votes, and get in. It's very difficult to do it without that. With thinly spread support, you can't win seats.
There's a website called Electoral Calculus, isn't there, which has tried to work out that question, and it estimates that UKIP would have to win more than 20% of the vote to get seats. That's if there's a uniform national swing, if the picture's the same everywhere. 20% nationwide, which is clearly it's a long way off doing
that.
Yeah,
it won 3% last time.
So we might theoretically be better off, say, just spending all its time in 5 or 6 constituencies, spending all their time there just basically working.
Yes.
And constantly campaigning.
They've not been very good at doing that.
Yeah.
They've not been very good at doing that. The Liberal Democrats have.
Their position has improved a little bit because they now have a number of councillors. What is it, 186 councillors, which they didn't used to have. And the Liberal Democrats demonstrated that is a way that you can get into an area. So you have a presence on councils. This increases your profile in that constituency, and it can help. But it's it might be a necessary but not sufficient condition for winning a seat.
Yes, my name is Andres Peterson. I work for the University of Iceland. I would like to play a little bit devil's advocate and ask you, what if the Commission or the European Union really just wants to get rid of the UK, don't want to have this trouble, doesn't want to give them any options, they say, let's get rid of them. How do you see that as a possibility? Or do you see that as a possibility?
Yeah, there were opinion polls, I think, in some EU member states recently where a majority of those in France said the European Union would be better off without Britain in it. Yes, the big issue related to that is what, if anything, could Britain renegotiate? As Rick said, Britain's only going to get things if it can persuade other member states to support it. So it is interesting, for example, in the Netherlands recently, they've had a review of what the EU does and have basically said, this far but no further. Angela Merkel has said that although she doesn't support a rolling back of EU powers, Britain would have to be given something. So it's possible that EU states would give Britain something, but it certainly won't be enough to persuade many Eurosceptics in Britain. But you're right, the danger for Cameron is going to these negotiations and saying, look, I'm going to put this to a referendum, so you need to give me lots of things. The European Union could just call Cameron's bluff and say, OK, hold your referendum, see what happens. It's a danger in terms of a tactical ploy in EU negotiations.
Yeah, and if that were to happen, then there's a greater likelihood that there'd be, if Cameron couldn't negotiate much, that an in-out referendum would be lost by the people that want to keep Britain in which case, UK would be out.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Matthew. Coming from Britain, I think you've covered this really well, actually. Especially, I would like to emphasise to Icelandic people that the question of British exit from the EU is just as much a question of national party politics rather than national politics, and it's really important that they understand that. But I'm just trying to think outside of the box a little bit and ask you guys an interesting question that wouldn't normally come up maybe. How do you feel about the theory that UKIP is a bunch of turkeys voting for Christmas, and that they actually, yes, they want EU exit, but in many ways it's not good for them because it would be the death knell of their party, essentially. So does that explain why they're trying to shift their stance towards anti-immigration laws, human rights laws, things like that? And actually, they're just trying to slow down the entire process of EU exit and be a thorn in the Conservative side. Yeah.
It's a big strategic issue that does cause some tensions within the party, because clearly there's a large number of people in UKIP who would be perfectly happy to leave the party or wind it up if there was an in-out referendum that voted for Britain to go out. But there'd be some who wanted to carry on and pursue that broader agenda. So it is a dilemma for them. And of course, cynics would argue that UKIP has members in the European Parliament, it doesn't have MPs, so being in the European Parliament gives UKIP resources. It allows people like Nigel Farage to have this platform, not just in Britain, but across the European Union. So in some respects, being in the EU provides the lifeline that UKIP needs to be able to campaign at all.
But the other thing they have done, of course, is develop policies about what they would do if Britain were out of the EU, haven't they? So a lot of their manifesto, some of it, the one that David Campbell-Bannerman was influential in writing, says, if we didn't pay all this money to the EU, we could redistribute resources to these areas. So there's a group within the party that have got ideas about what they could do if they formed a government and took Britain out of the EU. And so, but there are plenty of them as well, I think, who would say, if we get out, that's it, we've achieved what we want, and then we go back to the other parties.
Some of you earlier today, I'm going to return the favour of your question this morning.
All right.
Now we have Iceland is under threat from the European Union about imposing economic sanctions due to the mackerel dispute. Would you think that there's a pressure from the British political parties for imposing economic sanctions against Iceland in the mackerel dispute in order to prove the benefits of the European Union or to prove its usefulness? And if such sanctions were imposed, do you believe that that would impact the UKIP followers in the coastal areas that you mentioned earlier?
I don't know enough about this case to I really don't know enough about that case to answer that. I don't know whether you.
No, I think you've gone beyond our knowledge of Icelandic politics there. Not overly familiar with the dispute. Sorry.
Perhaps we can talk about it afterwards, but I don't know enough about it to be able to answer that question well, I'm afraid.
Well, basically, just the background. It's the dispute on mackerel quotas that have been moving around, and well, we're under threat of economic sanctions due to the fact that the EU is accusing us of overfishing, because of course the Scottish would like to, and the Irish would like to fish a little bit more. And it was more in light of the fact that you mentioned that in the coastal areas that Euroscepticism was higher due to fisheries. So I was just proposing that it might prove the benefits of the EU membership if the EU is actually acting on behalf of these coastal areas. If you you think that such an act?
I don't think it would. Yeah, I think it's. I don't think the Conservatives, for instance, would take that approach. I know. I can see what you mean. That you could say, well, we can bring you benefits by being in the EU if we can cause problems for Iceland. But I don't think that approach would be taken. I don't know what you think.
No, I don't know. No, I think that the only point, it's a peripheral one that I can make, is that in 2005, the Conservative Party manifesto said that Britain should leave the common fisheries policy. But the Conservatives were then persuaded to try to reform it from within. And they seem relatively satisfied that the new reforms have done enough to make the common fisheries policy more palatable. It's not going to be a big issue in British politics, though, as you say, in some constituencies it might be.
Yeah, I think we have come to our final question. And that's you.
Yeah, my name is Juan, and I would like to ask you about the anti-immigration position that you had under the hypothesis that, let's say, you go out from the EU and abolish somehow immigration. How will you deal with the thousands of immigrants that are living there and working there for several years that have died? All this because, under this hypothesis, how can you suggest that can you deal with this problematic?
There's no easy answer to that. In parks, I'm not sure there are that many precedents. It's not clear what would happen if Britain left the European Union. What would then happen to EU nationals resident in the UK? Would they lose their citizenship rights? Would those rights be seen as acquired rights that carry on even though Britain's no longer in the EU? UKIP's position, I think, is that once Britain leaves the European Union, the EU nationals legally resident in Britain can stay, but would have to fit certain certain criteria, rather, like be in work, for example. But it's just not clear.
Yeah, UKIP are not talking about deporting people and this sort of thing. Their position is to...
Not yet.
Well, no. Their position has been to freeze immigration, hasn't it? And for a 5-year period. But yes, but it's really unclear. And I think the report from the House of Commons that came out last week, you could answer that better than me, but I think that suggests that there's a great deal of uncertainty about what would happen because I don't think there are legal precedents for it.
If we turn the question round, there are 1.5 million British citizens who live in other EU countries. If they're entitled to vote in an in-out referendum in Britain, that could sway the outcome. If they were told you're going to lose your home in Spain if Britain leaves the European Union.
Okay.
A horrible prospect.
Yeah. I think it's time to say.
Thank you very much.
It's fine. We have finished our time. I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for extremely interesting lecture and sort of very good discussion. And thank you all for attending and taking part in the discussion. Let's give them a good applause.
Thank you.